Hello, listeners! Today we are doing something out of the ordinary, and we will be joined by a true titan from the Swedish RPG industry. Before I introduce our guest further, though, I thought I would like to welcome Andreas Lundström, who was our lore master when we played Kin-strife, and will be my co-host for today's interview. How are you doing, Andreas?
I'm doing very well, thank you.
And it's excellent to have you here, especially because I know that you have a fairly deep knowledge of the Lord of the Rings and all the great lore that is there, quite a lot more than I do. So I hope that will improve our conversation today. But without further ado, let me then introduce our guest, Anders Blixt, who was the project leader for the Kin-strife module. Can you tell us a bit about yourself and your history in the role-playing business?
Yeah, good morning from Stockholm. It's very nice to join you two guys here and talk about Kin-strife, which is one of my favorite projects during my 42 years in the role-playing game hobby. Well, I am one of the ends of a Swedish role-playing community. Yeah, I've been around since 1977 when I was introduced to role-playing games at the first Swedish gaming convention, Gothcon 1, and that was Dungeons and Dragons, the original edition, the parchment colored booklets, and I was immediately fascinated by this new type of gaming. So I started with Traveller science fiction because that's my line of business. Started game mastering, and I started writing for Traveller already in 1979 and got published in Journal of Traveller's Aid Society. So I spent the early 80s being a Traveller fan, in a 100% Traveller fan, and also playing a lot of RuneQuest at the side. In 1985, I was hired by Target Games, the only Swedish publisher of role-playing games. I was put in charge of the product lines Drakar and Demoner, which is a fantasy game based on RuneQuest and Magic World, and Mutant, which is mutants in a post-Holocaust Sweden setting. I spent 4 years there. Introduced MERP to Sweden, and then when I left for a new career in the military, and then I started freelancing for Iron Crown, and that's how I came to write Kin-strife and other things. And since then I just kept on writing. I write games, English, Swedish. I write novels in English, and I'm having a generally good time.
That sounds really, really lovely, and we're of course very, very thankful for the contribution that you've made to the Swedish role-playing hobby. Can you tell us a little bit about your relationship with Tolkien's works? How was that something that you were read up a lot on before you got into the Kin-strife module? Or?
Yes, definitely. I started reading Tolkien in Swedish translation in 8th grade, that's in the early 70s. And this was just an amazing literary experience. I was absorbed by his world, so I started reading everything I could get hold of by him. I remember when Silmarillion was published in 1977, I think, it wasn't available in Sweden, and my father ordered it from Britain for my sake. That shows the level of enthusiasm I have for Tolkien's work, and I'm still a Tolkien enthusiast.
Fantastic, and you can really tell that when you read the Kin-strife module that there's a lot of love for the professor's works in there.
We really strove to capture the spirit of Tolkien's Middle-earth in that module, and I think we did a fairly good job.
We would certainly agree. So can you give us a short pitch for Kin-strife? What is the module actually, and how did it actually end up landing with you?
Kin-strife deals with the immense civil war that Gondor suffered in. It's 1,600 years before Lord of the Rings. It's depicted in the appendices. It was actually my idea. I had worked with Iron Crown during my time at Target Games when we published the Swedish edition of MERP and a few MERP modules such as Mirkwood and Rohan. And then when I had left Target Games and was working elsewhere, I still kept in touch with the Iron Crown people. I even went to see them once in Charlottesville. And I got acquainted with a chap called Chris Seaman, who is a literary scholar in the United States, equally interested in Tolkien, and he and I talked a bit about what we could do, and then I pitched the Kin-strife project to Jessica Nay Grimm, who was in charge of that product line at Iron Crown, and she was definitely enthusiastic. She wanted a thick source book on Kin-strife, and Chris and I thought, yeah, we'll fix that together. And then we enlisted the help of some other friends. You can see, if you check the credits page, you can see that there's a lot of Swedish names there. It's friends of mine who have contributed various special knowledge. So we spent the early 90s writing it. I don't remember exactly the dates, but it was like 92, 93, 94, I think.
That is a pretty long project then, several years. So
I can't exactly remember how long time it took, because first we wrote it and then it ended up at Iron Crown, where it took some time to get developed. Because we were so many people involved, it was plenty of text, and we had to write it all of us had jobs, so we had to write things in our spare time.
Yeah, and as you say, the credits page is really quite interesting with all those Swedish names. You're not necessarily used to seeing that in a Middle-earth Roleplaying module. You have yourself, Mats Blomqvist, Gunnar Brolin, Sanna Fogelvik, Åke Rosenius, who we know from those wonderful comics that he makes, and Dag Ståhl, Hanska is here also. So it's a really interesting module from sort of a Swedish perspective. So really cool to see.
This was in the infancy of internet. So Chris persuaded me to get an email account at BBS, which was, and I had to acquire a modem. This was really Stone Age technology. So we were actually chatting by sending emails to one another with in text editors, text only, and it was very plain. But it was great because suddenly you could swap ideas across the Atlantic in real time. And I remember that my first experience, I was sitting down at the computer, logging in on this BBS, opening the text editor and sending off something to Chris, and like 5 seconds later I had his answer. And today it seems pretty banal, but in 1990, must have been 91, 92 somewhere, it was amazing. It was like, this is fantastic. So, and then we started writing bits and pieces, and we divided the job between us, and I enlisted my Swedish friends. And gradually just grow. Chris contributed a lot of these historical, ideological outlook on how Gondor works and why there was a rebellion and so on. Gunnar, who is a lawyer, he contributed a lot of input on demographics and legal matters. And Mats Blomqvist and I, we were more into plotting adventures. And Chris and I were really trying to cover all the ground. That Gondor as a whole engulfed in a conflict. It's like Gondor's equivalent of the American Civil War, lasting for 10 years.
Indeed, and it feels like a product that is very sort of, it's really worked through. Everything is very much thought through and feels very realistic, which I think is very interesting. You don't necessarily, fantasy doesn't always have that sort of roots in realism, but here is a module that really feels like it could have been about sort of a historical period in our world, but now it is in Tolkien's world. Then.
Yeah, you're right about that, and that's thanks to the good professor's ability to design societies. He provided a base, a foundation we could stand solidly on. And then, I mean, I have a background an academic background in political science and history. Chris is very much into classical literature. So we could, both he and I, we could use our academic skills to fill out the voids and really create a complete palace on top of Professor Tolkien's stone foundation. And for me, it's very important to have credible societies. They don't necessarily have to be realistic, but they have to be realistic in the fantasy world. They have to stick together, no plot holes, no contradictions.
One of the things I reflected upon when I read the module with sort of looking at it with today's eyes is you mentioned the American Civil War, and maybe that is a very good analogy, actually, because I was struck by how sort of righteous Eldakar's side is and sort of how nefarious Castamir, the usurper, is portrayed as. It's a fairly black and white portrayal, which, of course, civil wars as we maybe see them today, you can maybe see them more in terms of grayscale. So was this sort of to try to stick to Tolkien's view on his world? Because I feel like that is also a fairly black and white world when it comes to good and evil. Would you have wanted to work more in grayscales, or was it sort of conscious?
It was necessary to write it in that way because that's the way Tolkien's world is. So it's realistic in the context of Middle-earth. It is not realistic in the context of our world. So in Tolkien's world, the ideals of the Dunedain, of the Valar, they are good. They are white. And Castamir strayed away from them, hence he was bad. So it was. So we really tried to be faithful to Tolkien's ideas for how Middle-earth works.
Yeah, I'm just going to do a follow-up on this one. I think really that the Kin-strife is an example of something quite unusual with Tolkien, is that this sort of idea of racial purity, which is often a theme in his world, that the Edain from the First Age, that the more they integrate with lesser men, as he puts it, the further they fall from the high and the elf-like Edain of the First Age, and in the Kin-strife and in the Civil War, as Tolkien himself writes it, it is Eldakar's side that are like the Castamir side they're the ones who want to keep this racial purification within the realm of Gondor, while Eldakar marries the daughter of the Rovanian king.
Mm. Yeah, this is... we took that from canon, and then Chris, who being classical scholar, he really knew how to develop the idea and explain it in the... That I left to him because I knew that's his expertise. And that was, again, we had this foundation. Tolkien had explained very clearly this is a matter of one side being the rightful king. He had inherited the throne in the line of succession, as Gondor's law stated. The usurper emphasized that the purity of the blood instead, and said that the king is a half-breed. He wouldn't use that word. But anyhow, I think Tolkien really portrayed this conflict. And for Tolkien, the important thing was obviously that the law and the right of succession trumped the purity of the blood. And that's why Castamir was bad and Eldakar was good, because Eldakar was lawful and Castamir was rebellious.
It's really interesting because you almost expect to find somewhere some source that Castamir was somehow manipulated by Sauron or something of the like. But that's not the case, is it? I haven't found any source that he was that his trying to ascend the throne was in somehow orchestrated by Sauron.
No,
right?
it wasn't. This was a purely internal Gondorian conflict. And that's why we came up with this traditionalist versus loyalist conflict. We created basically two parties with two ideologies, racial purity and or lawful succession.
Exactly. Well, while we're talking about canon as well, I have some questions, of course, because being a Tolkien enthusiast myself, I'm curious as to what info you got from, for instance, History of Middle-earth, and what was your own creation. So I have a few. If we're going to spend a lot of time on all these questions, we'll be here for hours and hours. So just some brief questions and some brief answers. For instance, I find that this module gives a very good background as to why Castamir's side held such power. How much of that was from canon? How much was your own?
That's mostly Chris's explanations. We realized that we must have an explanation why Castamir is so influential. Because Tolkien says that he's influential without explaining why. So Chris came up with this very detailed explanation of how it came to be that Castamir could lead this rebellion.
Yeah, and all the regions and the fiefs of Gondor, who was allied to who in the beginning, and
that's
like
something Chris and I worked out between ourselves, but it's mostly Chris's ideas there.
Okay. And the core Aran, Castamir's network
That's
of spies?
my invention. It's based on historical reality. If you go back to the Renaissance, the Habsburg Emperor, Holy Roman Emperor, had something called the Hofpolizei, the court police, which was a secret spy organization, which were quite efficient. And also in the reign of Elizabeth I in England, she had this Walsingham, who was running a very good spy network in Spain. And because of my military background, I was fairly well versed in how Stasi, the East German secret police, worked. So I used ideas from there as well. And I think that turned out to be quite a nice addition to the society.
It did add some flavor, no doubt about it. And the relations with Harad, with them sending prince hostages to Gondor?
It's our invention, but it kind of fits the context so well. And it's a traditional, if you look at Central Asia, this was a very common arrangement in the late Middle Ages and the Renaissance in Central Asia. Yeah, so we just kind of borrowed an idea. Tolkien would never have mentioned anything like that, I believe. But we thought that was a good addition.
But it fits very well, I think, with the relationship historically between Gondor and Harad as well.
Definitely.
And Adunafel is immensely interesting as well, the female Nazgul.
It's MERP's invention. It's Iron Crown's invention.
Yeah, because it's already been published in another MERP module beforehand, right?
Yeah, definitely, it had. And we decided to use it to make it fit into Iron Crown's depiction of Middle-earth. I mean, for Tolkien, having a female Nazgul would have been unthinkable. He didn't have the world view where such a thing would work out. But since Iron Crown had added it, we decided to use it.
It's a very interesting idea, and it's one of the Nazgul depicted in I don't remember which MERP module it is, but they're listed, all the 9 of them, who they were and where they came from.
I know, and she's also on the front of Gorgoroth, the Gorgoroth module, where you have 3 Nazguls riding. And if you check closely, one of them has a female body shape.
I never thought about that. Interesting. Okay. The Kuliondo.
Yeah, that's Chris's ideas entirely. It was based on a plot he had run in his own MERP campaign. And then he developed it for his plots in the Kin-strife. And I thought they were just so great. he really got this thing with the Beruthiel, which is just like a footnote in Tolkien's appendices. He created a very good story around that, but it's entirely Chris's.
Yeah, we could talk for hours about Beruthiel as well, I think, but let's move on. And because Tolkien, he drew a lot of maps. The city maps, I guess, are your team's maps. Were any of them based, I don't know if you remember this, but are any of them based on city maps that because he used to scribble down all kinds of maps? And
actually, city maps were made by Iron Crown, and we had to use them as they were. The honor map is from the Minas Tirith module, and so on. The Pelargir map is from the Lebenian module. The only one we had could give some input on, there was a new Umbar map, and Umbar, that part was developed by Gunnar Berlin, the lawyer I mentioned earlier. He was very dissatisfied with Iron Crown's ideas about Umbar, so he proposed an improvement, which Jessica accepted, and then it resulted in the map you find in Kin-strife.
I find your memory is very, very detailed and accurate so many years later.
Thank you. Well, I was so involved in this project, and that's why I remember it so well.
The module as a whole, I mean, we only played one very short scenario from one of the cities. But if you look at the module as a whole, it's quite sandboxy, right? Not very linear. It's was it because I find that many MERP modules were like that? They're just backgrounds for you to use and put in your own adventure as you like.
That's my preference. That's how I wanted to build it. I don't like linear plots or dungeon crawls. I want politics and espionage and forcing the players to take their own initiative, forcing the players to decide how they want to solve the problem. I don't want to present a solution to them.
I have some very short questions about some dedications and thanks as well. You dedicated the module to Kai Munk. Tell us a bit about that.
Kai Munk was a Lutheran pastor in Denmark before and during World War II, and a very interesting character. He wrote theater plays, and he was a kind of conservative opponent to the German occupation, and he spoke out openly, and he was assassinated by German agents for that reason. And he felt the necessity of speaking out against the darkness that had descended on Europe. I feel it somewhat suits the Middle-earth atmosphere. You have to stand up and speak out against Sauron, or do things against Sauron, even if it's very dangerous. That's the only way of surviving. Or at least your culture, your ideals to survive.
Yeah, and it really, as he says, it really fits very well, I think. And Tolkien was what do you call it, vehement anti-Nazi. Some special thanks to Homer and Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Find that also very interesting.
I can explain that.
A bit amusing. Like, which were the Homeric influence on Kin-strife?
If you look at the adventure called Bergil's Odyssey, chapter 9.1, there is a lot of poetry in English in that section, because there is clues hidden inside a rather dreary piece of poetry. It's on page 193 in the module. And this is Homer. I can't write hexameter verse in English or in Swedish for that reason. So I simply took an old translation of the Odyssey and rewrote it, changed names, changed words, just kept the rhythm to make it work out. So I used a public domain translation to avoid any legal entanglements, and modified it and modernized and so on. That's the explanation for that particular adventure. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the adventure Candle Burning Bright by Åke Rosenius in the Pelagio chapter, side page 52, is actually based on a Sherlock Holmes story, The Adventure of the Devil's Foot Root. And the reason I know about this is that Åke phoned me and said, I have a very hard time coming up. I need another adventure, but I have a very hard time coming up with a plot. And I like Sherlock Holmes stories, and the Adventure of the Devil's Foot Root is one of those that I remember very vividly. It's a rather frightening story. And so I told him, please go to the library and check the Sherlock Holmes section and read this particular short story, and then phone me again. So he did, and he thought, that's a good idea, and I would like to do it this and this way. And then I suggested a few details here and there, and then he wrote the adventure. So that's how Sir Arthur Conan Doyle got into it.
Interesting. When you worked at Target Games with Äventyrsspel during the 80s, the Swedish roleplay production company, and you introduced MERP to Swedish, I really find that those modules that you publish in Sweden are a lot more easy to read and a lot more accessible than these MERP modules who quite often, a few of them, not Kin-strife, but a lot of the other ones, are quite dreary and really heavy to plow through.
I edited the translations quite thoroughly to improve readability, improve accessibility. That's as simple as that. We hired a translator who translated the text straight, and then I just, being the editor, I just sat down and improved things. It's the same content, it's
a lot more accessible, very much so.
We had some sort of standard at Target Games, how we want our products to look like, to be read. I mean, we were writing in those days, our customers were like 12, 13, 14 years old. So we had to make the texts very accessible, because otherwise the customers, the boys wouldn't buy them. So it was a commercial decision. And
a very good one, even for me as a 40-year-old adult. It's, I'd rather pick up the Anduin's Vålnad than the Ghost of Anduin.
And the same thing goes for the layout and design, which was not my responsibility. It was Claes Berndal and Nisse Gulliksson who were responsible for all the layout and drawings and illustrations, and so. And we used Ann-Sofie Kvarnström to make maps, which were easier to read than the original maps, less cluttered. And Olle Salin was spending a lot of time improving on the layout of buildings. I remember that. Not necessarily, we could shift doors and change the purpose of rooms to make them more realistic or more reasonable, I would say, rather than realistic. My favorite example there is, that was my own decision, with in Southern Mirkwood, Dol Guldur, in the original version, there is a very detailed description of Sauron's quarters at the bottom level of Dol Guldur. He has certain rooms for himself. And I was like, Sauron's bedroom? This is ridiculous. This is plain ridiculous. Sauron doesn't have a bedroom. He doesn't sleep. So I changed it. I wrote just, this is here. These rooms are Sauron's private quarters. Something like, if anyone without invitation enters them, he will immediately be struck by madness from the horrors he encounters. Period.
Yeah,
no further.
Which is a lot more realistic than Sauron having a bedroom with a nightstand table.
Yeah, exactly. You don't enter Sauron's private quarters. Period.
No, you don't. No, you don't. No, you don't. Speaking of NPCs, you wrote there's a great number of NPCs you wrote for Kin-strife, and of course they are your own creation. Yeah. Do you have any favorites still today that you still remember?
Yeah, let's see here. There is in the Minas Honor chapter, slum quarters outside the gates of refugees. And the leader of that slum quarter is a tiny woman, tiny, strong-willed woman. And I was newly married at that time, so I put my wife there depicted her as the leader of these people, which I found rather. She found it very amusing. She likes Tolkien a lot, so that was no problem. And then in the Minas Honor, I think it was Minas Honor, Minas Ithil chapter, there is a lady running a clinic, medical clinic of some kind, and she has a husband who is dealing in healing drugs. That's two friends of mine, which is correct. I mean, she is a physiotherapist and he is a pharmacist, so I thought I could put them in there very nicely.
Oh, great! So you really use your surroundings in the real world too.
And in the Bergil's Odyssey, you find a married couple with a son, where the lady is a swordsman. And they are also based on some friends of mine. So I found. I mean, I always checked with people whether it was okay to depict them in this particular manner, and all of them thought it was nice. So,
all right. So next question. There are many names we recognize from Silmarillion and Lord of the Rings. He himself reused many of his names. Maiglin, for one, is a name I find it very nice to see in there, and Hador, Orodreth, Nathan, the Wronged.
We just picked up Tolkien's tradition and thought, okay, people are named for great heroes of the past, just like we have people today who are called Alexander or Roland or Arthur. I mean, let's do the same thing.
You talked a bit earlier about your military background. I assume that was a big help in writing because you wrote the organization of the Navy and Army of Gondor.
Yeah, that Gunnar Brolin and I worked out. He is a lawyer, but he's also a student of history, and particularly military history. So he and I, we went through Renaissance and late Middle Ages and Renaissance, and used that to develop the army and the Navy. When I later wrote for the Southern Gondor modules, I had great help with him. He helped me again. There we depicted the deterioration of Gondor's armed force, how it changed because Gondor got poorer and smaller.
Well, the Kin-strife, the module, it still has a very good reputation in Sweden and also internationally as being one of the best modules from MERP. And having read quite a few of them, I really agree about that. There's stuff here for years and years of role-playing, even including a scenario where if there would be a need to motivate the character to travel to a new location, you have stuff for that.
Yeah, well, Chris and I decided that we need to cover the whole, and that it was kind of my responsibility to create these things with how to enable players to move around. This thing going north to seek Eldakar, it was also entirely my idea, because I felt like we need to be able to open a link of communication between the rebels in Gondor and the king beyond the river in a faraway land. So that led to this rather gruesome adventure where people want to behead Eldakar.
I have one last question before I turn the mic over to Mattiaz once again, and it's about the One Ring, Marco Nepatello and Marco Maggi's rule system that we used when we played this scenario. Have you looked at it?
I read parts of the One Ring. I have it in my bookshelf. It's a very Middle-earthy game system. It really captures the feeling of Tolkien's world, definitely. I like this arrangement they have with adventures. You have first you have something dramatic, and then you have a fellowship phase when people get together and drink beer, and that's a very Tolkienian approach to making adventures.
And it's really how The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, those stories are like. You travel to Bree, then you rest there, and you travel to Rivendell, you rest there, you go to Lothlorien, you rest a while.
Exactly.
They really looked at the source material and thought, okay, this is a major theme in Tolkien. How can we include this rule-wise in a game?
I think this may have to do with Tolkien's experience as a soldier in World War I, because the British army had organized that you served 2 weeks at the front and then 2 weeks in a rest camp behind the front. So I think I don't know whether it was a conscious decision of his, but it would have been a very natural arrangement for his because he was so used to it.
I have a greetings for you from Francesco Nepitello. He sends his greetings, and also if you're ever interested in writing Tolkien stuff again, RPG-wise, you're free to contact him.
Yeah, I would definitely do that. So send me his email address, please.
Wow, that's amazing. Maybe we have through this... maybe we will be the reason of some exciting new modules coming then. That would be really, really cool. So I think those have been some really interesting answers, and I think we have learned a lot more about the background to this fantastic module. So with that, I would really like to thank you for your time, Anders. We really appreciate you taking the time for us and for everything that you've done for the hobby over the many, many years.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure to join you here, and since it's Saturday morning here in Stockholm, I have nothing else on my hands, so I could spend hours talking about Tolkien's games.
Yes, that's true. Do you want to say a few words about what you're working on right now and where we can follow your work?
Yeah, you can follow my work at my blogs, The Dream Forge, gondika.wordpress.com. And currently I'm working on the reboot of the Swedish horror game Shock, where I'm writing a creepy adventure in Stockholm in 1987. And after that, I will deal with the reboot of the Swedish post-Holocaust game Wastelands. And what will come after that, I have no idea. But just take a look at my blog and you'll find out what I'm doing.
Fantastic. So thank you again. And thank you, Andreas, for doing this project with us. Do you want to remind us again where we can follow your work, maybe primarily within podcasting, which is how we came in contact?
Yeah, of course. So for the Swedish listeners, I have my podcast Tärningen är Kastad, which in Swedish is the Dice Cast. But I will be starting 2 new podcasts in English. One D&D podcast, Dungeons and Diceappointments. Probably release first episodes in late September, probably. And also a podcast called Sweden Rolls, where I will game master 4 Swedish actors in different Swedish role-playing games. So we will play in English, but we will play only Swedish RPG games.
Wow, those are some really, really exciting projects. We very much look forward to listening to that. So I would like to thank you both for your time, and thank you, dear listener, for continuing to follow our journeys through the many worlds we're getting to explore. So, see you soon again.